Everyone in the room froze when the door didn't just knock. It detonated inward like a shotgun blast of splinters and cold lake air. And there she was, Brenda Wickshire. Clipboard locked in her bony grip like it was an extension of her. Spine, chin high, eyes scanning for targets like a hawk about to strike. Her voice cut through the quiet, shrill, and certain. Immediate compliance, Mr. Holloway. Effective. But then she saw who I was with. Michigan's Attorney General stood right there in my kitchen, one hand on his coffee mug, the other still in the air from our handshake. For the first time, in all the months she'd stalked my property, Brenda's breath hitched. Ma'am, the AG said, calm as a frozen lake, you just committed multiple felonies in front of the chief law enforcement officer of this state. Please wait outside while we discuss your criminal charges. Her face turned the color of raw dough. The clipboard didn't look like a weapon anymore. It looked like a shield she suddenly realized was paper thin. And that's when I knew. Justice wasn't just on its way. It had already stepped inside my door. But this moment didn't just happen. You don't get here overnight. My name's Rex Holloway, and if you told me 3 years ago I'd be in a war with the president of my HOA, the kind of war that would pull in the state's top prosecutor, I'd have laughed you right off my dock. Back then, I'd just inherited my grandfather's old lake cabin in Lakeshore Pines, Michigan. 2.3 acres of woods and water, built with his own hands after he came home from Korea. I can still feel the grain of those cedar walls under my fingers. Still smell the mix of Old Spice and sawdust he left behind. This place wasn't just a house. It was history. I moved in after my divorce, looking for quiet, peace. A place where the loudest sound at night was the lapping of water against the dock Grandpa built. Instead, I got Brenda. Brenda, late 50s, failed insurance adjuster, now self-anointed queen of the HOA. She drove a spotless white Highlander with HOA official, plastered across the bumper like she was part of the Secret Service. Her khakis were pressed sharp enough to cut you, and she carried a measuring tape like a sword she couldn't wait to draw. She bullied her way to president in less than 2 years, promising to protect property values, and then making life hell for anyone who couldn't fight back. Bird feeders, vermin violations, Vietnam vet's flagpole, 3 inches too tall, a widow's wind chimes, noise pollution. But me? I was her white whale. The first time she came to my door, she handed me a courtesy notice, 47. Violations in one neat little packet. Everything from my dock supposedly being 3 feet too long to my fire pit being an unpermitted combustion structure. The bill? $500 in fees plus $75 a day until I complied. When I pointed out that my cabin was here decades before the HOA even existed, she smiled, that tight reptilian smile, and said, previous ownership is irrelevant, Mr. Holloway. All properties within HOA jurisdiction must comply regardless of construction date. 30 days or we file a lien. On land my grandfather built with calloused hands, on a shoreline he'd shaped with his own sweat. That night, I drove to the county courthouse, pulled every document I could find, and there it was. The HOA paperwork, filed 3 months after. Grandpa died, with his signature forged by the developer's son. The same developer's son who now sat on the HOA board. It wasn't an accident, it was fraud, but proving it, that was going to take more than anger. I'd need patience, evidence, a plan 10 times tighter than Brenda's petty tyranny. I didn't know it yet, but Brenda wasn't just after my cabin. She'd been fleecing half the neighborhood, targeting the elderly, the widowed, the ones who couldn't fight back. My war wasn't just mine anymore. 1 week later, at 6:30 in the morning, she was back, this time with a surveyor and a local tire shop owner named Dale Pritchard. They tromped around my property for hours while Brenda barked orders, snapping photos like a paparazzo with a vendetta, even through my windows. What she didn't know was that I'd installed security cameras the night before. Every step, every shout, every smug smirk was recorded in high definition. Legal, ironclad. Later, I'd find out that Dale owed $18,000 in back taxes, and Brenda's own insurance license had been pulled for fraud. Hypocrisy thick enough to spread with a butter knife. But back then, I was just beginning to understand. Brenda wasn't playing HOA president. She was running a full-blown racket. And I was about to become the first person in Lakeshore Pines to fight back and win. You ever see someone so sure they've got the upper hand, right before the ground drops out from under them? That was Brenda the morning her own hired help turned on her. It started with the surveyor, Jimmy Kowalski, leaning against his truck after a long day of measuring my property, glancing left and right before he spoke. His voice was low, like a man trying not to be overheard by his own conscience. "She only paid me half," he said, "and she told me to make up violations. Said if I didn't, she'd ruin my career." He didn't just say it. He swore he'd testify. I didn't smile. Not yet. I'd learned early in my military days that you don't celebrate halfway through a battle, not when your opponent is desperate enough to burn their own fort just to smoke you out. But Brenda's mask was starting to slip. I got my first real glimpse of her desperation the next day when my security cameras caught Jimmy taking a leak behind my shed. Classy, sure, not exactly criminal. But when Brenda heard about it, she acted like I'd caught him dumping radioactive waste. "I'm reporting this as a health code violation," she shrieked, lips curling back like a dog about to bite. I shrugged. "Sure, but you might want to explain to the health department why you hired him in the first place." It was almost funny. Almost. If she hadn't already slapped me with a $12,000 lawsuit and was actively trying to shut down my dock until the court sorted it out. Still, I was learning Brenda's rhythm, the way she moved, the way she struck. She'd make a big, noisy accusation to distract from whatever quiet little fraud she was working on behind the scenes. Her biggest mistake yet? Running her mouth at Murphy's Diner, telling anyone with a coffee cup that I was a dangerous, unstable veteran. That wasn't just a lie. That was defamation. And it built a rock-solid pattern of harassment for my counterattack. Every word she spat, I wrote down. Every letter, I scanned. Every photo she took, I matched with my own footage. Brenda thought she was tightening the rope around my neck, but really she was knitting her own straitjacket. That's when I brought in Stella Crawford, property attorney out of Grand Rapids. She had eyes like steel and a grin that warned you not to test her patience. We met at a coffee shop, and over one black Americano, she laid out my path forward. "Michigan has private attorney general statutes," she said. "You can sue on behalf of everyone she's victimized if you can prove systematic fraud. And your cabin, built before the HOA existed, she can't legally touch you." It was the first time in months I felt like I wasn't just defending myself, I was going on the offensive. We filed a counterclaim, fraudulent formation, elder abuse, harassment, the works. And that's when Dale Pritchard, the same Dale, who'd helped Brenda snoop around my property, accidentally dropped a bomb. At the next HOA meeting, right there in front of Brenda and her clipboard brigade, he blurted out that the formation paperwork was sketchy from day one. The room went still. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Brenda looked like she'd been smacked with her own clipboard. That's when my neighbor started stepping forward. Martha, whose garden Brenda made her dig up after 40 years of marriage. Tom, an Afghanistan vet, who said he'd never been more scared of anyone in his life. A young couple fined for their twins' sidewalk chalk drawings. One by one, the stories poured out. Different names, same pattern. Brenda always targeting the vulnerable, the ones she thought couldn't fight back. I could see it in her eyes at that meeting. She realized I wasn't alone anymore. The problem for her was, neither was she. Because what happens when a bully pushes too far? People stop hiding, they start documenting, they start talking, and they start fighting back. That night, sitting in my cabin with Stella's file folder open in front of me, I knew I'd crossed a line. This wasn't just about my grandfather's cabin anymore. This was about every single neighbor she'd trampled under the false banner of protecting property values. But the thing about cornering someone like Brenda, they'll do something reckless, something you can use against them, and she was just about to hand me the kind of evidence that could blow her whole little empire to pieces. You ever smell trouble before you see it? For me, it was rotting fish. Not just a whiff, either. The kind of rancid stench that clings to your clothes, seeps into your skin. I found the source at 11 o'clock at night, when my security, cameras lit up with movement. There was Brenda wearing her trademark pink gardening gloves, lugging a black trash bag toward my septic tank. I watched in silence as she dumped it out. Fish heads, guts, bones, still seasoned from Murphy's Diner's Friday night special. The next morning, the county environmental inspector showed up, responding to an anonymous complaint about contamination. One whiff, and he knew it wasn't sewage. It was catfish. Seasoned catfish. The inspector looked at me, then at Brenda, standing off to the side with her arms crossed like she was watching a victory parade. And for a split second, I thought she might actually throw up on her own shoes. This wasn't just petty anymore. This was criminal. But the fish fiasco was nothing compared to what came next. Through a paper trail Stella and I had been quietly building, we cracked open the HOA's financial records. $67,000. Gone. Drained from the reserves, funneled into Brenda's personal property management company, which, as far as we could tell, had never managed a single blade of grass. That money had gone to cover her son's failed restaurant venture and, here's the kicker, to pay off casino debts. It wasn't just fraud. It was theft. From the very people she claimed to protect. And Brenda must have known we were getting close, because that's when she made the mistake of pulling in more help. Enter Danny Kowalski, Jimmy's older brother. He was a PI, the kind of guy you hire when you want dirt, not truth. Brenda sent him after me, hoping he'd dig up something ugly enough to turn the tide. But Danny was a professional. And professionals don't like being asked to commit crimes. He came to me instead. She told me to plant evidence, he said, sliding a flash drive across my table. Said she'd pay me extra if it stuck. I recorded everything. I plugged it in. Crystal clear audio, Brenda's voice sharp as a knife. Find something or make it up. I'll pay a bonus if it sticks. It was the smoking gun. And now both. Kowalski brothers were willing to testify. Brenda's whole web was starting to unravel, but desperate people don't fold quietly. They lash out. A week later, I was sitting on my porch when 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up. They told me Brenda had filed a police report claiming I'd threatened her with my military skills and that she feared for her life. I didn't even get mad. I just handed over the file, hours of footage, dozens of witness statements, every email and text she'd sent. The officer flipped through it, sighed, and shook his head. Keep documenting, he said. She's hanging herself. And she was. Because after the false police report failed, she tried bribing the county inspector to cite me for more violations. She called my ex-wife to tell her I was unstable. She even paid a teenager $50 to dump motor oil near my dock, then phoned in another anonymous environmental complaint. Every move she made was more reckless than the last, and every one of them was recorded, logged, and ready for court. But the day I knew the tide was turning came when a Channel 7 news van pulled into my driveway. Brenda had fed them a story about a dangerous veteran terrorizing the neighborhood. They showed up ready to film a hit piece. I let the reporter in, poured her a cup of coffee, and set out the files, the footage, the testimonies, the paper trail. That night, the news aired not Brenda's version, but the truth, a segment titled HOA Horror, When Neighbors Attack. By the next morning, the Attorney General's office had confirmed an investigation, and something incredible started happening. Victims from all over Michigan came forward, people I'd never met, people from other towns, other HOAs, all with the same story, Brenda's name, her methods, her scams. The woman who thought she could intimidate me into silence had just awakened an entire state's worth of enemies. And that's when the Attorney General called to bump up our meeting. We weren't just going to talk about my case anymore, we were going to bring her down, for good. The morning the Attorney General was due to arrive, the lake was so still it felt wrong, like the whole shoreline was holding its breath. I stood on my dock, coffee in hand, watching the mist curl off the water. Somewhere in the trees, a crow called, sharp, impatient. I knew that feeling because this was it. Months of documenting, of neighbors whispering in parking lots, of piecing together the trail she'd left behind. It was all funneling into this one day, and Brenda didn't have a clue how close she was to stepping off the edge. The night before, I'd gathered what we'd started calling the coffee club. Martha, Tom, the young couple with the chalk drawing, twins and half a dozen other neighbors who'd been in her crosshairs. We crowded into my cabin's living room, file folders stacked on the coffee table like sandbags in a flood. "This isn't just about me anymore," I told them. "We have one shot to make this stick. The AG's not here for a fishing trip. He's here to shut her down." Martha's hands trembled as she slid a manila envelope toward me. Inside were decades of receipts for her garden, the one Brenda had made her dig up. Tom dropped a flash drive on top of it, security footage of Brenda leaning over his fence, taking photos while he was in the shower. The young couple brought their own stack, violation notices over stick figure chalk drawings and a $300 fine for a hazardous tricycle left in the driveway. We were no longer a group of isolated victims. We were a united front. And when you take away a bully's favorite weapon, fear, all they have left is noise. Brenda's noise was about to get drowned out. That morning, the AG's black SUV pulled into my driveway, tires crunching over gravel. Out stepped Santos, tall, deliberate, the kind of man whose presence makes people choose their words carefully. We shook hands, went inside, and barely had time to pour coffee before the sound of tires squealing tore through the quiet. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Brenda's Highlander slammed to a stop, her door flying open before the engine even cut off. She marched up the steps with her tape measure already out, barking about non-compliant railing height and immediate inspection orders. She didn't knock. She didn't pause. She stormed straight in, braking and entering in front of Michigan's top law enforcement officer, and then she froze. Her eyes locked on the AG's badge. "Ma'am," Santos said, his voice low and steady. "You've just committed breaking and entering, trespassing and harassment in front of the chief law enforcement officer of the state. Please wait outside while we discuss your criminal charges." She stammered, tried to muster that old Ice Queen composure, but the words tangled in her throat. I laid out the evidence right there on the kitchen table. The videos of her planting fish guts and motor oil, the audio of her instructing investigators to fabricate violations. The paper trail proving she'd siphoned over $60,000 from the HOA, and then my ace. The original 1960 deed from my grandfather's trunk, the one that proved our property line stretched 40 feet beyond where Brenda had claimed. 40 feet that included her precious rose garden and the gazebo she'd used for HOA parties. Her eyes darted over the document. She swayed slightly like the ground had shifted under her. "You've been trespassing on my land for years," I said. "Everything you've built there, mine." Silence. Not even the crow outside dared to break it. Santos leaned forward. "We have enough here for fraud, embezzlement, harassment, elder abuse, and criminal trespass. I strongly suggest you get legal counsel." Brenda turned without a word, the tape measure hanging limp in her hand. She walked out slower than she'd come in, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't look like she was in control of anything. A week later, the FBI came at dawn. They arrested Brenda and Dale Pritchard on federal charges. Her clipboard lay in the driveway like a fallen crown. The HOA was dissolved. Restitution was ordered for every victim, and the neighborhood, the same one she'd spent years dividing, began to stitch itself back together. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Because justice isn't just about the sentence. It's about making sure the damage can't be done again. And we were just getting started. The morning after Brenda's arrest, the air in Lakeshore Pines felt different. Lighter. Like someone had finally cut the anchor we didn't know we'd all been dragging behind us. Word traveled fast in a small town. By sunrise, neighbors were out on porches, coffee mugs in hand, trading glances like they weren't sure if they could believe it. By mid-morning, they weren't just talking. They were smiling. For the first time in years, Brenda's white Highlander wasn't crawling the streets like a shark. No tape measure, no clipboard, no one lurking in the bushes at 9 o'clock at night to catch a violation. It was over. Or at least, that part was. Because Brenda might have been gone, but the damage she'd done was still sitting in our yards, in our bank accounts, in the way people flinched at the thought of getting mail from the HOA. The week after the arrest, the judge dissolved the HOA completely, a clean wipe. No more dues, no more manufactured rules. But that also meant there was no official structure for fixing what she'd broken. So we made one. It started with Martha. She was the first to knock on my door, arms full of flower bulbs and a trowel in her back pocket. "If we're taking back the neighborhood," she said, "I'm starting with my garden." We dug side by side in the cool spring dirt, planting rows of marigolds where her hydrangeas used to be before Brenda made her rip them out. Tom showed up with a wheelbarrow, hauling fresh soil. The young couple brought their twins, who left. A rainbow of chalk drawings on my driveway. No fines attached this time. Word spread. By the end of the month, every Saturday looked like a block party. People repairing fences Brenda had made them tear down. Hanging flags she'd forced them to lower. Painting over the ugly brown compliance notices she'd left stapled to doors. And for the first time since I'd moved here, I felt like I belonged. But I won't lie, the victory was bittersweet. I'd sit on my dock at night listening to the water and think about my grandfather. About the cedar walls he'd planed by hand, the summers we'd fished until the light was gone. This cabin had been his refuge after a war, and for years Brenda had turned it into a battlefield. And yet, in tearing it apart, she'd also done something she never intended. She'd brought the community together. That thought stuck with me. So I took the Rex Defense Fund, the coffee can full of crumpled bills and spare change that the hardware store had set up when things were at their worst, and I told the neighbors we were going to use it for something better. We started a veterans retreat right here at the cabin, a place where people who'd been through their own wars, the kind you can't see, could fish off the dock, sit by the fire, and remember what peace feels like. Martha volunteered to run the bookings. Tom offered to guide fishing trips. Even the twins' parents pitched in, baking pies for guests. It wasn't just about fixing what Brenda had broken. It was about building something she couldn't touch, something rooted deeper than her petty rules and fake authority. But every now and then, I'd get a reminder of how close we'd come to losing it all. A letter from a neighbor who'd been fined into near bankruptcy. An email from someone in another town asking if we could help them fight their own corrupt HOA. A voicemail from the Attorney General's office updating me on Brenda's case. She'd pleaded not guilty at first, but the evidence was too much. The recordings, the paper trail, the testimonies. Piece by piece, the fortress she'd built out of fear crumbled until there was nothing left to stand on. The sentencing date was set. And I knew I'd be there. Not to gloat, not to get the last word, but to make sure she saw what she'd created without meaning to. A neighborhood stronger than she ever imagined, and to let her know she'd never get the chance to tear it apart again. You'd think walking into a federal courthouse would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt heavy, like carrying the weight of every neighbor's story in one bag, and knowing that if anything went wrong, we'd all have to pick it back up. Again. The day of Brenda's sentencing, the sky over Grand Rapids was the same dull gray as her Highlander, the one now gathering dust in an impound lot. I walked up the courthouse steps with Martha on one side, Tom on the other, and a quiet line of neighbors behind us. We weren't there for a spectacle. We were there for closure. Brenda was already inside when we entered, sitting next to her, lawyer in a navy suit that was trying too hard to look respectable. She didn't look at us. Not once. The prosecutor laid it out in cold, methodical detail. The embezzlement, the harassment, the forged documents, the planted evidence. Every charge backed by photos, recordings, and the kind of testimony that doesn't shake under cross-examination. When they played the audio of her telling Danny Kowalski to make it up for a bonus, I saw her shoulders tense. When they showed the footage of her dumping fish guts by my septic tank, she pressed her lips so tight they went white. And when they displayed the original 1960 deed proving my grandfather's land and her rose garden were mine, she finally dropped her eyes to the table. The defense tried to spin it. Stress, misunderstandings, mismanaged funds. They even hinted at mental strain from years of community leadership. But the judge didn't buy it. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about my cabin, or the fines, or the nights I sat awake wondering what stunt she'd pull. Next, I talked about Martha's garden, Tom's dignity, the twins' chalk drawings, the way fear had settled into this neighborhood like fog, and how hard we'd had to fight to burn it off. Brenda didn't just break laws, I said. She broke trust. She took something that was supposed to protect a community and used it to tear people down. And the only reason we're standing here today is because enough of us decided we weren't going to let her keep doing it. The judge listened, hands folded, eyes steady, and then, in a voice that left no room for argument, he read the sentence. 5 years in federal prison, restitution to every victim, and a lifetime ban from holding any position in a homeowners association. It wasn't the end of her life, but it was the end of her power. Brenda didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, like if she didn't look at us, none of it was real. The marshals led her out in silence. We walked back into the gray afternoon, without cheering, without high fives. It wasn't that kind of victory. This was the kind where the best part is the quiet that follows. That night, I sat on the dock with a mug of coffee, watching the water ripple under the moon. The air was so still you could hear the faint laughter of kids from across the lake, something I hadn't heard in years, without also hearing Brenda's voice somewhere in the background. And yet, even with her gone, there was a part of me that couldn't relax completely. Because I knew there were other Brendas out there, other neighborhoods fighting their own wars against people who thought rules were weapons. The difference now was, we had a blueprint. We knew how to fight, and, as I sipped that coffee, I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. It was a warning, and a promise. It's strange how fast silence can turn into laughter. 1 month after Brenda's sentencing, Lakeshore Pines didn't just feel different. It sounded different. Kids playing tag in the street without parents glancing nervously over their shoulders. Neighbors chatting over fences without lowering their voices. Music floating from porches without anyone measuring decibel levels. It was like someone had lifted the lid off a pot we didn't know was boiling. The first big project came from Tom. He'd been quiet for years, the kind of man who kept to himself unless Brenda was in his driveway with a clipboard. One morning, he stopped by my cabin with a battered tackle box and a grin I hadn't seen before. "Thinking we turn your dock into something bigger," he said. "A place where folks can fish, hang out, maybe teach the kids a thing or two." By the weekend, half the neighborhood was there, hammering boards, sanding planks, running extension cords for work lights when the sun went down. It wasn't just a dock anymore. It was a meeting place. The same place Brenda had once tried to shut down was now where the community came together. Martha kept her promise too. Her garden bloomed like it was making up for lost time. Rows of bright marigolds, hydrangeas, and roses that climbed the fence like they'd been waiting for permission. Every week, she clipped fresh flowers and left them on neighbors' porches. No notes, no explanations, just quiet kindness where once there had been quiet fear. And the twins? Their chalk drawings became a permanent fixture. Rain would wash them away, and the next day, there'd be a new set. Superheroes, sunsets, stick figure fishing trips. But it wasn't all perfect. Every so often, someone would bring up a story that made the air in the room change. A letter they'd gotten from Brenda that still sat in a drawer. A fine they'd paid that they could never get back. A reminder that for years, one person's cruelty had seeped into every corner of our lives. That's when we started the Friday coffee tradition. Not just for catching up, but for making sure no one went quiet again. We'd meet on my porch, or Tom's, or sometimes in Martha's garden, and we'd talk. About everything, about nothing. About how we'd never let another Brenda walk in and convince us she was untouchable. One Friday, a man I didn't recognize showed up. Name was Walter. Lived 2 towns over. He'd heard about our case on the news and wanted advice on dealing with his own HOA nightmare. We gave him more than advice. We gave him copies of our legal filings, a list of resources, and Stella's card. A few weeks later, he called to say his HOA president had resigned before the case even hit court. That's when I realized we weren't just fixing our own neighborhood. We were showing other people it could be done. The veterans' retreat at the cabin grew faster than I expected. We had guys coming in from as far as Ohio, men who hadn't touched a fishing pole in decades, sitting on the dock in the evening light like they'd been there their whole lives. Martha handled the bookings. Tom ran the trips. The twins. Parents made sure every visitor left with a pie. One evening, after the last boat had come in, I stood on the dock with Tom, watching the sun sink low over the lake. He looked out over the water for a long time before speaking. "You know," he said, I think your granddad would have liked this. I didn't answer right away, just watched the reflection of the sky ripple in the water. Yeah, I said, finally. I think he would have. We stayed there until the last light faded, the sound of laughter carrying over the water. For the first time in years, there was no shadow hanging over the neighborhood, no one measuring our lives in inches, and violations. Just people. Just home. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew there was only one thing left to do to close this chapter for good. Everyone asks me the same thing now. Was it worth it? They mean the court battles, the sleepless nights, the mornings I woke up wondering what new stunt Brenda would pull before noon. They mean the months I spent with a camera in one hand and a stack of violation notices in the other, and I tell them the truth. It wasn't about worth. It was about not letting someone like her decide what my life, or my grandfather's legacy, was going to look like. The cabin still smells like cedar and Old Spice when the sun warms the walls just right. The dock still creaks in the same place it did when I was a kid. Some mornings I'll catch myself, running my fingers along the grain of the wood like I'm checking to make sure it's still here, still mine. But the real change isn't in the cabin. It's in the people. Martha's garden is the first thing you see when you turn onto our road now. A riot of color spilling over the fence, defiant in the best way. Tom's dock project turned into a full-on pier, where anyone can drop a line or just sit and watch the water. The Twins chalk art has its own section of pavement we call Sidewalk Gallery, repainted every summer by every kid who wants to join in, and the rose garden Brenda once guarded like it was the crown jewel of Lakeshore Pines. It's a compost bin now. The soil feeds Martha's flowers. Even in ruin, it gives back. Maybe the only good thing Brenda ever left behind. Sometimes I think about the day she stormed into my cabin, tape measure in hand, ready to knock me down one last time. I wonder if she knew then how it was going to end, if she realized she was about to lose everything, not just her clipboard, not just her title, but the fear she'd built her whole little empire on. I doubt it. Bullies don't see the cracks until the whole wall comes down. One evening, not long after her sentencing, I sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the sun slide down behind the trees. The lake was still, the way it gets right before dark, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't listening for the sound of her tires in the driveway. I wasn't wondering what fight tomorrow would bring. I was just here. The thing about standing up to someone like Brenda is, it doesn't just change the fight. It changes you. You stop thinking about how to survive the next hit, and you start looking for ways to make sure nobody else has to take it. That's why the Veterans Retreat isn't just a side project now. It's part of who we are. People come here to fish, to rest, to breathe. They leave knowing there's a place in the world where community still means something. And every time I see a new face on that dock, I think about the day I almost gave up. The day it seemed easier to just pay the fines, tear down the dock, and let Brenda win. If I'd done that, none of this would be here. Not the garden. Not the pier. Not the laughter carrying over the water on a summer evening. So, was it worth it? I'll let you decide. But I'll tell you this. Standing up to a petty tyrant isn't just about winning for yourself. It's about making sure the next guy doesn't have to fight the same battle. Because when you push back, you give someone else permission to do the same. And maybe that's the real legacy here. Not the cabin. Not the land, not even the legal victory. But the fact that when one person tried to tear us apart, we came together, stronger, louder, and ready to defend what mattered. So I'll ask you what I ask everyone who hears this story. What would you do if your HOA nightmare turned into a fight for your entire community? Tell it. Share it. Because you never know who might need that courage next. And if you believe in standing up to bullies, well, you know where the subscribe button